The morning sun cast long shadows across the stone corridors of Clarence House as Prince William made his way through the familiar halls. His footsteps echoed against the ancient walls, each step carrying the weight of a conversation he had been dreading for months. The palace staff moved quietly around him, their eyes downcast as they sensed the tension that had been building like a storm cloud over the royal household. William paused outside the ornate doors of the Queen Consort's private study, his hand hovering over the brass handle. Through the heavy oak, he could hear voices, Camilla's crisp tone cutting through the air like a blade, followed by the more measured responses of her security detail. He had requested this meeting weeks ago, but Camilla had repeatedly postponed it, citing various royal engagements and state duties. Now, finally, she had agreed to see him. The relationship between William and his stepmother had always been complex, fraught with the shadows of the past and the weight of public expectation. Since his father's accession to the throne, those tensions had only deepened. Camilla's influence over King Charles had grown stronger with each passing month, and William found himself increasingly shut out of important decisions that affected not just the monarchy, but his own family's future. He knocked twice and waited. The voices inside fell silent, and after a moment, Camilla's voice called for him to enter. William pushed open the doors and stepped into the richly appointed study. Camilla sat behind an impressive mahogany desk, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. She wore a cream-colored suit that emphasized her status as queen consort, and her pale blue eyes regarded William with barely concealed irritation. "William," she said, not bothering to rise from her chair. "I trust this won't take long. I have a meeting with the Prime Minister in an hour." Two security guards flanked her desk, their posture rigid and alert. William recognized them both, seasoned professionals who had served the royal family for years. Their presence struck him as unusual for what should have been a private family discussion, but he said nothing about it initially. "Thank you for finally making time," William replied, his tone carefully neutral. He moved to one of the leather chairs positioned in front of her desk, but remained standing. "We need to discuss the children's security arrangements." Camilla's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "I wasn't aware there were any issues with the current arrangements." "There are when those arrangements change without consultation," William said, his voice gaining an edge. "George, Charlotte, and Louis have had the same security team for 3 years. These men know them, understand their routines, and have built relationships of trust. Now I'm told they're being replaced." "The security needs of the royal family have evolved," Camilla replied smoothly. "Your father believes it's time for a more comprehensive approach to protection." William felt his jaw tighten. His father, always his father, never Charles, never the king. Camilla had a way of invoking his father's authority whenever she wanted to shut down discussion. But William had learned through bitter experience that many of these decisions bearing his father's supposed blessing originated from Camilla herself. "More comprehensive?" William repeated. "What exactly does that mean?" "Because the head of my children's security detail was told his services were no longer required as of next Monday. No explanation, no transition period. Just dismissed." "Detective Inspector Morrison has served admirably," Camilla conceded. "But the threat assessment has changed. We need people who are more adaptable to new protocols." William took a step closer to the desk. "What new protocols? What threat assessment? I'm second in line to the throne, and these are my children. Don't you think I should be involved in decisions about their safety?" For the first time, one of the security guards shifted slightly, his hand moving almost unconsciously toward his radio. The movement was subtle, but William caught it. The atmosphere in the room was changing, growing more tense by the moment. "You are involved," Camilla said, her voice taking on a patronizing tone. "You're being informed of the changes. That's involvement enough." "No," William said firmly. "That's not involvement. That's notification. There's a difference." Camilla leaned back in her chair, studying him with those cold blue eyes. "William, you seem to be under the impression that you have some sort of veto power over security decisions. Let me clarify something for you. You don't. These decisions are made at the highest levels of government and the palace, levels that currently don't include you." The words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. William felt a flush of anger rise in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. This was exactly the kind of response he had expected from Camilla, the subtle reminder of his place in the hierarchy, the gentle but firm assertion of her superior position. "Those children are my responsibility," William said quietly. "Catherine and I are their parents. We have a right to be consulted about decisions that affect their welfare." And they are members of the royal family, Camilla countered. Their welfare extends far beyond your parental concerns. There are considerations of state security, public safety, and royal protocol that must take precedence. William could feel the conversation slipping away from him, becoming a power struggle rather than a discussion about his children's well-being. This was Camilla's specialty, taking legitimate concerns and reframing them as challenges to authority, turning family discussions into matters of royal prerogative. I want to speak with my father about this, William said. Your father is the one who approved the changes, Camilla replied without missing a beat. Did you think this was my decision alone? But William had learned to read the subtle signs of Camilla's deceptions over the years. The slight tightening around her eyes, the way her fingers drummed once against the desk surface, the pause before she spoke, all indicators that she was, at minimum, stretching the truth about his father's involvement. Then, I'll hear that from him directly, William said. Unfortunately, His Majesty is dealing with several pressing matters of state this week, Camilla said, consulting her calendar with theatrical precision. The earliest I could arrange a meeting would be, let's see, perhaps next month? Next month. After the new security arrangements had been implemented, after the old team had been dispersed to other assignments, after the fait accompli had been established. William recognized the tactic. It was one Camilla had used repeatedly during his father's marriage to her, delaying uncomfortable conversations until circumstances made them moot. This is unacceptable, William said, his voice rising slightly. You're deliberately obstructing my access to my own father. I'm managing His Majesty's schedule according to his priorities, Camilla replied coolly. If you have concerns about security arrangements, I suggest you take them up with the appropriate departments. The appropriate departments take their orders from this office, William shot back. From you. From the crown, Camilla corrected, which I represent in my role as queen consort. There it was, the naked assertion of power that had been building throughout the conversation. Camilla was making it clear that she considered herself the gatekeeper to the king, the filter through which all family business had to pass. It was a role she had been building toward for years, but never had she stated it so baldly. William looked at the two security guards, both of whom were now watching him with increased attention. He realized that his raised voice had triggered their protective instincts, that they were beginning to see him not as a family member expressing concern, but as a potential threat to the queen consort. I think you're forgetting something important, William said, lowering his voice but allowing steel to enter his tone. I may not be king yet, but I will be someday. And when that day comes, I'll remember every slight, every obstruction, every time you put your personal agenda ahead of my family's welfare. Camilla's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or fear. It was impossible to tell which. Is that a threat, William? It's a fact, William replied. You can play these games with my father, but you won't play them with me forever. The tension in the room was now palpable. Both security guards had shifted position, moving slightly closer to their protectee. William noticed that one of them had his hand on his radio, ready to call for backup if the situation escalated further. I think this meeting is over, Camilla said, reaching for the telephone on her desk. Perhaps you should take some time to consider your tone and your attitude before we speak again. My tone, William said incredulously. My attitude. I came here to discuss my children's safety, and you've turned it into a lecture about knowing my place. You've dismissed their security team without consultation, blocked my access to my father, and now you're acting as if I'm the one being unreasonable. You are being unreasonable, Camilla said, her voice growing sharper. You're acting like a spoiled child who can't accept that others might know better than you do. The words hit William like a physical blow. It was the same language Camilla had used about him when he was actually a child, grieving his mother's death and struggling to accept his father's new relationship. The casual cruelty of it, the deliberate echo of old wounds, took his breath away for a moment. Don't, he said quietly, his voice deadly calm. Don't ever speak to me like that again. I'll speak to you however I see fit, Camilla replied, standing up from her chair. You seem to have forgotten that I am queen consort of this realm, and you are a prince who serves at His Majesty's pleasure. And you seem to have forgotten that I am his son, William said, taking another step forward. His eldest son and heir to the throne. A throne that seems very far away at the moment, Camilla said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Your father is in excellent health, William. You might be waiting a very long time. The implication was clear, that William's eventual succession was not a given, that circumstances could change, that his position was less secure than he believed. It was a masterful piece of psychological warfare, striking at his deepest anxieties about his role and his future. William felt something cold settle in his stomach. This wasn't just about security arrangements anymore. This was about power, about control, about who would ultimately shape the future of the monarchy. And Camilla was making it clear that she intended to be the one holding the reins. "Guards," Camilla said suddenly, her voice sharp and commanding. "I think His Royal Highness needs to be escorted from the premises. He seems overwrought." William stared at her in disbelief. She was actually having him removed from the building. Him, the heir to the throne, her stepson, the father of her step-grandchildren. The audacity of it was breathtaking. The two security guards looked uncertain for a moment, caught between conflicting loyalties. They knew who William was, knew his position in the royal hierarchy. But they also knew who was giving them orders, who controlled their assignments and their careers. "Ma'am," one of them said hesitantly, "perhaps His Royal Highness would prefer to leave voluntarily?" "I would prefer," William said, his voice cutting across the room like a blade, "to finish this conversation with my stepmother. But it seems she's decided that's not going to happen." "The conversation is finished," Camilla said firmly. "Guards, please escort His Royal Highness to his car." The two men moved forward reluctantly, their discomfort obvious. William could see the conflict in their faces. They were trained to protect members of the royal family, not to remove them from royal buildings. But orders were orders, and Camilla's authority in this building was absolute. "This isn't over," William said quietly, looking directly at Camilla. "This conversation, this issue, none of it. You can have me escorted out, but you can't make the problems disappear." "We'll see about that," Camilla replied, her smile growing more confident. "Perhaps by the time you're allowed back, you'll have remembered your manners." Allowed back. The words echoed in William's mind as he turned toward the door. She was treating him like a visitor, like someone whose access to royal buildings was contingent on her approval. The realization of how far her power had extended hit him like a physical blow. As he walked toward the door, flanked by the two uncomfortable security guards, William felt something fundamental shift inside him. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore. This was war, quiet, civilized, conducted with smiles and proper protocol, but war nonetheless. And Camilla had just made the first major move. The corridors of Clarence's house seemed different as William walked through them, the familiar halls now feeling foreign and hostile. Staff members who had known him since childhood averted their eyes as he passed, unwilling or unable to acknowledge what they were witnessing. The Prince of Wales, future King of England, being escorted from a royal building like an unwelcome guest. As they reached the main entrance, William turned to look back at the building that had been like a second home to him for years. In one of the upper windows, he could see a figure watching, Camilla, no doubt ensuring that he actually left the premises. Even from this distance, he could sense her satisfaction, her pleasure at having demonstrated her power so decisively. The security guard stopped at the threshold, clearly reluctant to actually escort him to his car. William nodded to them curtly and walked the rest of the way alone, his mind already racing with the implications of what had just happened. This wasn't just about his children's security anymore. It was about the future of the monarchy itself, about who would control the institution he was destined to inherit. As his car pulled away from Clarence's house, William's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it, expecting perhaps a conciliatory note from Camilla or a message from his father. Instead, it was from Catherine. How did it go? William stared at the screen for a long moment, wondering how to explain what had just transpired. How could he tell his wife that her children's grandmother-in-law had just had their father escorted from a royal building? How could he explain that the woman who would help shape their children's future had just demonstrated exactly how little she thought of their family's concerns? The car moved through London traffic, carrying William away from Clarence's house and toward an uncertain future. Behind him, Camilla was undoubtedly already making phone calls, spinning the narrative of what had happened, ensuring that her version of events reached the right ears before his did. She was a master of palace politics, and she had just scored a major victory. But as William watched the city pass by his window, he felt something else growing alongside his anger and frustration. Determination. Resolve. The kind of cold, focused fury that had driven his ancestors to build an empire and defend a throne against all challengers. Camilla might have won this battle, but the war was far from over. The emergency family meeting was held in the drawing room of Kensington Palace, away from the prying eyes and ears that seemed to permeate every corner of the main royal residences these days. William had called it within hours of his confrontation with Camilla, reaching out to the few family members he still trusted completely. The autumn rain pelted against the tall windows as Catherine poured tea with hands that trembled slightly, her usual composure shaken by what William had told her about his encounter at Clarence's house. Princess Anne arrived first, her silver hair still damp from the rain, her face set in the grim expression that had become her default whenever family politics were discussed. She embraced William briefly, a rare display of physical affection from the famously reserved Princess Royal, before settling into one of the ornate chairs with military precision. "I heard about your ejection from Clarence's house," and said without preamble, her voice dry as autumn leaves. "The security detail is already talking. Word travels fast in our circles." William felt a flush of embarrassment rise in his cheeks. The idea that palace staff were gossiping about his humiliation was almost more galling than the humiliation itself. "How much do they know?" "Enough," and replied curtly. "Enough to understand that Camilla has decided to flex her muscles publicly. This wasn't just about security arrangements, William. This was a demonstration of power." Catherine set down her teacup with a soft clink that somehow sounded loud in the quiet room. "The children are asking questions," she said softly. "George wanted to know why Detective Inspector Morrison wouldn't be around anymore. He's been with us since George was born. He's almost like family." The pain in her voice was evident, and William felt his anger toward Camilla intensify. It was one thing to target him directly, quite another to disrupt his children's lives to make a point about hierarchy and control. Morrison had indeed become almost like family, a constant, reassuring presence who had helped the Wales children navigate the unique challenges of growing up in the public eye. "Where's Morrison now?" Anne asked, her strategic mind already working through the implications. "Reassigned to general duties," William said bitterly, "along with the rest of their team. Scattered to different departments. Their institutional knowledge of my children's needs considered irrelevant." The drawing room door opened quietly, and Prince Edward entered, followed by his wife Sophie. Edward looked uncomfortable, as he always did when family disputes reached this level of intensity. Sophie, however, wore an expression of barely controlled fury that surprised William. The Countess of Wessex was usually the peacemaker in family disputes, but something about this situation had clearly pushed her past her usual diplomatic stance. "We came as soon as we got your message," Sophie said, settling into the chair next to Catherine. "Edward wanted to check with Charles first, but I told him this was family business, not court business." Edward shifted uncomfortably. "I just think we should be careful about how we handle this. Charles is under enormous pressure with the new government, and the last thing he needs is internal family drama becoming public." "This isn't drama," William said sharply. "This is about the welfare of my children and the future stability of the monarchy. Camilla is overstepping her authority, and someone needs to call her on it." "But is she overstepping?" Edward asked hesitantly. "As queen consort, doesn't she have a role in these decisions?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. It was the fundamental issue that underlay all of their current problems, exactly what role Camilla should play in the monarchy, and how far her authority extended beyond being Charles's wife. And leaned forward, her blue eyes sharp with intelligence. "Let me ask you something, Edward. When Elizabeth was queen consort, did she make unilateral decisions about security arrangements for family members? Did she block access to George VI? Did she have family members escorted from royal buildings?" "That was different," Edward protested weakly. "The circumstances were completely different." "Were they?" And shot back. "Or is the difference that Elizabeth understood the difference between being married to the king and being the king herself?" Sophie reached over and placed a restraining hand on her husband's arm. "What Anne is saying is that there are precedents here, Edward. Historical precedents about the role of a queen consort that Camilla seems to be ignoring." Catherine spoke up quietly, her voice carrying the weight of careful consideration. "It's not just about precedent, though. It's about what's happening to this family. The children barely see their grandfather anymore. Every request to visit has to go through Camilla's office. Every family gathering is subject to her approval. She's becoming a barrier between Charles and his own family." William nodded gratefully at his wife's support. Catherine had a way of cutting through the political complexities to the human heart of issues, and she was absolutely right about the growing distance between Charles and his children and grandchildren. "The question is what we do about it," and said pragmatically. "Direct confrontation clearly doesn't work. William discovered that today. Camilla has positioned herself too well, and she has Charles's ear completely. Maybe that's the real problem," Sophie said thoughtfully. Maybe Charles doesn't fully understand what's happening. Maybe he's so focused on his royal duties that he's not seeing how Camilla is isolating him from his own family. Edward looked skeptical. You really think Charles doesn't know what his own wife is doing? They've been married for years. He knows exactly who she is and how she operates. Or maybe he's chosen to know only what he wants to know, and suggested. It's easier to let Camilla handle the difficult family relationships than to deal with them himself. Charles has never been comfortable with confrontation. William stood up and moved to the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. The garden beyond was gray and subdued, matching his mood perfectly. He thought about his father, about the man who had struggled for decades to balance his royal duties with his personal desires, who had finally achieved the crown he had waited for his entire life, only to find it came with complications he hadn't anticipated. There's something else, William said quietly, not turning from the window. Something Camilla said today that's been bothering me. She made a comment about the throne seeming very far away, about my father being in excellent health, and me potentially waiting a very long time. The room fell silent. Even Edward looked disturbed by this revelation. The implication was clear and deeply troubling, that Camilla might be thinking in terms of extending Charles's reign indefinitely, perhaps even considering ways to alter the succession itself. She wouldn't, Catherine whispered. She couldn't. The succession is established by law. Laws can be changed, and said grimly, especially if you have the ear of the monarch and the patience to work slowly, carefully, building support over time. Sophie leaned forward, her face pale. You think she's actually planning to interfere with the succession? I think she's planning to maximize her own power for as long as possible, William said, finally, turning from the window. And if that means keeping Charles on the throne longer than might be natural, if it means marginalizing me and my children, if it means redefining the very nature of the monarchy to suit her ambitions, then, yes, I think she would consider all of those options. The magnitude of what William was suggesting settled over the room like a heavy blanket. They were talking about something unprecedented in modern royal history, a queen consort actively working against the established order of succession, not for ideological reasons or matters of state, but for personal power and influence. Edward shook his head slowly. This is conspiracy thinking, William. Camilla might be overreaching her authority, but suggesting she's plotting to undermine the succession itself, that's a very serious accusation. Is it more serious than what she's actually doing? And asked sharply, look at the pattern of behavior. Isolating Charles from his family, placing her own people in key positions, controlling access to information and decision-making processes, humiliating potential rivals publicly. These aren't the actions of someone planning to gracefully step aside when the time comes. Catherine set down her teacup and looked directly at her husband. What do you want to do, William? What's your plan here? It was the question William had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. What was his plan? Direct confrontation had failed spectacularly. Working through official channels seemed pointless when Camilla controlled those channels. Appealing to his father's better nature assumed that Charles was willing to see past his wife's influence, an assumption that seemed increasingly naive. I want to document everything, William said finally. Every decision made without consultation, every access denied, every instance of overreach. I want to build a record that we can present to the Privy Council if necessary. Edward looked alarmed. The Privy Council? William, that's almost like a constitutional crisis. You're talking about formal complaints against the Queen Consort. I'm talking about preserving the integrity of the monarchy, William replied firmly. Someone has to be willing to stand up and say that this behavior is unacceptable, that the institution is bigger than any one person's ambitions. And nodded approvingly. Documentation is smart, but it's not enough by itself. We need allies, people in positions of influence who can see what's happening and are willing to act. The private secretaries, Sophie suggested. Surely some of them are uncomfortable with the changes in protocol and procedure. Some are, William confirmed. But they're also career civil servants who understand which way the wind is blowing. Speaking out against Camilla could end their careers, and they know it. Catherine stood up and moved to stand beside her husband at the window. What about the press? They've been remarkably quiet about the changes in palace operations, but some of them must have noticed. The press is a double-edged sword, and warned. Once this becomes public, it becomes impossible to control. Every family disagreement, every policy dispute, every minor irritation becomes front-page news. Is that really what we want for the children? William thought about George, Charlotte, and Louis about their carefully protected childhood suddenly becoming tabloid fodder. The idea was nauseating, but the alternative, allowing Camilla to continue her systematic consolidation of power unchecked, seemed equally dangerous to their future. There might be another way, Edward said hesitantly. A quieter way. What if someone spoke to the Archbishop of Canterbury? Quietly, privately, expressing concerns about the spiritual welfare of the royal family? The church has significant moral authority, and the Archbishop has the king's ear. And looked intrigued. That's not a bad idea. The Archbishop is one of the few people who can speak to Charles as both sovereign and man, who can raise concerns about family unity without it seeming like political maneuvering. Would he do it? Catherine asked. Would he be willing to get involved in something like this? He might, Sophie said thoughtfully, especially if it's presented as a matter of pastoral care rather than political intrigue. The Archbishop takes his role as spiritual advisor to the royal family very seriously. William felt a flicker of hope for the first time since leaving Clarence House that morning. The Archbishop of Canterbury was indeed one of the few people whose moral authority transcended palace politics, who could speak to his father about family relationships without triggering Camilla's defensive mechanisms. It's worth trying, William agreed. But we need to be careful about how we approach him. This can't seem like we're asking him to take sides in a family dispute. Leave that to me, and said decisively. I've known the Archbishop for years, and I understand how to frame these things properly. I can have a conversation with him about family unity and the importance of maintaining strong relationships across generations without mentioning Camilla specifically. The plan was taking shape, but William could see the skepticism still lurking in Edward's eyes. His uncle had always been the most risk-averse member of the family, the one most concerned with maintaining stability and avoiding controversy. But even Edward seemed to understand that the current situation couldn't continue indefinitely. There's one more thing we need to consider, Edward said slowly. What happens if this doesn't work? What if Charles chooses Camilla over family unity? What if he sees our concerns as disloyalty rather than legitimate grievances? It was the question none of them wanted to confront, but Edward was right to raise it. They were potentially embarking on a path that could permanently damage relationships within the royal family, that could create rifts that might never heal. Then, we'll deal with that when we come to it, and said firmly. But we can't let fear of consequences prevent us from trying to address a situation that's clearly untenable. Catherine reached for William's hand, squeezing it gently. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. As a family. The simple gesture of solidarity meant more to William than he could express. Catherine had married into this complicated, dysfunctional, endlessly scrutinized family, and she had every right to want to avoid the kind of confrontation they were contemplating. Instead, she was standing with him, supporting his decision to fight for their children's future and the integrity of the institution they would someday inherit. The rain outside was beginning to intensify, drumming against the windows with increasing force. William thought about the symbolism of it, the storm gathering outside while they huddled together in the drawing room, making plans to weather an even greater storm that was brewing within the royal family itself. So we're agreed? And asked, looking around the room. I'll approach the Archbishop discreetly. William continues documenting instances of overreach. We all keep our eyes and ears open for allies and opportunities. One by one, they nodded their agreement. Even Edward, despite his obvious reluctance, seemed to understand that some kind of action was necessary. As the family members prepared to leave, Sophie pulled William aside. Be careful, she said quietly. Camilla is more dangerous than you might realize. She's had years to perfect her political skills, and she has every advantage except one. What's that? William asked. She's not the future, Sophie replied. No matter how much power she accumulates now, eventually it will pass to you. And she knows it. That makes her unpredictable, and that makes her dangerous. As William watched his family members leave Kensington Palace, disappearing into the stormy London evening, he reflected on Sophie's warning. Camilla was indeed dangerous, perhaps more dangerous than any of them fully understood. But she wasn't the only one who could play the long game. The monarchy had survived challenges before by adapting, by finding ways to preserve its essential nature while changing its external forms. The battle lines were now drawn, the alliances formed, the strategy decided upon. What remained to be seen was whether those would be enough to preserve the future of the institution William loved and was destined to lead. The Archbishop of Canterbury's study at Lambeth Palace felt like a sanctuary of calm in the midst of the storm that had been brewing within the royal family for weeks. Afternoon light filtered through the ancient stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the worn Persian rugs as Archbishop Michael Richardson finished his morning prayers and prepared for what he knew would be a difficult conversation. Princess Anne had requested this meeting with unusual urgency, and her carefully worded message had hinted at serious concerns about family unity within the House of Windsor. Anne arrived precisely on time, as was her custom, dressed in a simple navy suit that reflected both her respect for the Archbishop's office and her preference for understated elegance. She accepted the offered tea with a gracious nod, but barely touched it as she gathered her thoughts for the conversation ahead. "Your Grace," and began, her voice carrying the weight of genuine concern, "I've come to speak with you about a matter that weighs heavily on my heart. It concerns the spiritual and emotional welfare of our family, particularly the growing distance between His Majesty and his children and grandchildren." Archbishop Richardson leaned forward slightly, his intelligent eyes reflecting both sympathy and curiosity. He had served as spiritual advisor to the royal family for nearly a decade, and he understood the complexities that lay beneath the public facade of royal unity. "I have noticed that family gatherings seem to have become less frequent," he admitted carefully. "Is there something specific that concerns you?" And chose her words with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating the dangerous waters of royal politics. "The children, William's children, barely see their grandfather anymore. Every interaction must be scheduled through intermediaries, every family moment subject to approval from sources that seem removed from natural family bonds." The Archbishop set down his own teacup, recognizing the gravity beneath Anne's diplomatic language. As someone who had officiated at royal weddings and christenings, who had provided spiritual counsel during times of crisis, he understood the vital importance of strong family relationships in maintaining the emotional health of individuals who lived under constant public scrutiny. "Family unity has always been essential to the strength of the monarchy," he said thoughtfully. "When family bonds weaken, the institution itself becomes vulnerable. Are you suggesting that something is actively interfering with these natural relationships?" "I'm suggesting that protocols have been established that seem designed to limit rather than facilitate family interaction," and replied carefully. William was recently encouraged to leave a family meeting before it was concluded. The children's security arrangements were changed without consulting their parents. Access to His Majesty requires scheduling through channels that sometimes seem more concerned with gatekeeping than with family welfare. Archbishop Richardson absorbed this information with the gravity it deserved. He had seen enough of royal family dynamics to understand the coded language and was using. Someone with significant influence was systematically controlling access to the king, and the natural bonds between generations were being strained as a result. "Have these concerns been expressed directly to His Majesty?" he asked. And slight pause spoke volumes. "That has proven challenging. The same protocols that limit family access also make it difficult to raise concerns about those protocols. It becomes a circular problem." The Archbishop stood and moved to the window overlooking the Thames, his mind working through the implications of what Anne was telling him. In his role as spiritual advisor, he had observed changes in King Charles over the past months, a growing isolation from family members he had once been close to, a reliance on a very small circle of advisors, a seeming distance from the concerns of his children and grandchildren. "The spiritual health of a family depends on open communication and genuine love," he said slowly. "When barriers are erected between family members, when access becomes a matter of bureaucratic approval rather than natural affection, the soul of the family begins to wither. And for a family that serves as the symbolic heart of the nation, such withering can have consequences far beyond the personal." And nodded, sensing that the Archbishop was beginning to understand the seriousness of the situation without requiring her to make more explicit accusations. "The children ask questions," she said quietly. "They wonder why they can't simply visit their grandfather, why conversations must be scheduled weeks in advance, why their father sometimes returns from family meetings looking troubled." "Children are remarkably perceptive," the Archbishop agreed. "They sense tension and distance even when adults try to hide it. And these particular children will someday bear enormous responsibilities. They need the foundation of stable, loving family relationships to prepare them for those burdens." The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. The Archbishop's secretary entered with an apologetic expression. "Your Grace, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I have an urgent call for you." The caller says it's regarding the royal family. Archbishop Richardson exchanged a meaningful glance with, and before nodding to his secretary. "I'll take it in here," Thank you. The phone call was brief, but illuminating. As the Archbishop listened, and could see his expression growing more grave. When he hung up, he turned back to her with obvious concern. That was my counterpart at Canterbury Cathedral, he said quietly. It seems that certain administrative changes are being proposed regarding the spiritual care of the royal family. Changes that would centralize decision-making about religious ceremonies, christenings, and pastoral care through a single office. And felt a chill run down her spine. What kind of centralization? The kind that would require approval for any spiritual counsel provided to family members, any religious ceremonies involving the children, any pastoral visits or guidance. The Archbishop replied. It's being presented as a matter of efficiency and coordination, but it would effectively give someone veto power over the family's spiritual life, and finished. The Archbishop nodded grimly. I'm beginning to see a pattern here, Your Royal Highness. What you're describing, the control over access, the bureaucratization of family relationships, and now this attempt to centralize spiritual authority. These are the hallmarks of someone trying to establish comprehensive control over the royal family's private life. And leaned forward, sensing that the Archbishop was finally grasping the full scope of the problem. Your Grace, I believe the spiritual welfare of this family is at genuine risk. The bonds that have sustained the monarchy through centuries of challenge are being systematically weakened by someone who seems to view family relationships as obstacles to be managed rather than treasures to be protected. Archbishop Richardson returned to his seat, his expression reflecting deep concern. What would you have me do? My role is to provide spiritual guidance, not to involve myself in family politics. I'm not asking you to involve yourself in politics, and assured him. I'm asking you to fulfill your pastoral duty. When you see a family in spiritual crisis, when you observe the breakdown of bonds that are essential to their well-being, doesn't your calling require you to offer guidance? The Archbishop was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with the competing demands of his role. Finally, he spoke with the authority of his office. You're right, of course. When family relationships are damaged, when children are separated from grandparents, when love is bureaucratized into scheduled appointments, these are matters of spiritual concern that transcend politics. Would you be willing to speak with His Majesty? And asked quietly, not about politics or palace intrigue, but about the importance of family unity, about the spiritual damage that occurs when barriers are erected between people who should love each other freely. I think that conversation is not only appropriate, but necessary, the Archbishop agreed. His Majesty needs to understand that strong family bonds aren't just pleasant luxuries. They're spiritual necessities, especially for people who bear the unique burdens of royal duty. And felt a surge of relief and gratitude. The Archbishop's moral authority was exactly what the family needed. Someone who could speak to Charles about these issues without triggering the defensive mechanisms that had been erected around him. There's one more thing, and said hesitantly. The person who seems to be orchestrating these changes, she has considerable influence over His Majesty's schedule and priorities. Getting access to him for this conversation may prove challenging. Archbishop Richardson smiled grimly. One advantage of my position is that certain protocols don't apply to spiritual emergencies. I believe I can arrange a meeting that bypasses normal scheduling procedures. As and prepared to leave, the Archbishop walked her to the door of his study. Your Royal Highness, I want you to know that I take this matter very seriously. The spiritual health of the royal family affects not just your personal well-being, but the moral foundation of the nation itself. I will not allow bureaucratic interference to prevent me from fulfilling my pastoral duties. And grasped his hand warmly. Thank you, Your Grace. The children, all the children, deserve to grow up knowing their grandfather's love without institutional barriers. As Anne's car pulled away from Lambeth Palace, Archbishop Richardson returned to his study and placed a call to Buckingham Palace. The conversation was brief, but firm. He needed to see His Majesty as soon as possible regarding a matter of spiritual urgency. The King's private secretary attempted to schedule the meeting for the following week, but the Archbishop was insistent. This is a pastoral emergency, he said quietly, but firmly. His Majesty will want to address this immediately. Meanwhile, at Clarence House, Camilla was reviewing the day's schedule with her private secretary when her phone rang. The caller was someone from her network within the palace staff, someone who had been keeping her informed about potential challenges to her growing influence. Ma'am, I thought you should know, the voice said quietly. The Archbishop of Canterbury has just demanded an immediate meeting with His Majesty. His office called it a pastoral emergency. Camilla felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the sensation she always experienced when she sensed threats to her carefully constructed position. Did they specify what kind of emergency? No, ma'am, but the timing seems significant. Princess and was seen leaving Lambeth Palace this afternoon. The implications hit Camilla immediately, and was among the most formidable political operators in the royal family, and her involvement suggested that this was no ordinary pastoral concern. Someone was making a move against her, using the one channel she couldn't directly control, the church's moral authority over the royal family. When is this meeting scheduled? Camilla asked. Tomorrow morning, ma'am. Early. Camilla's mind raced through possible countermeasures. She couldn't prevent the Archbishop from meeting with Charles. Such interference would be too obvious and would likely backfire. But she could ensure that she was present for any follow-up discussions, could frame the conversation in terms that served her interests. Make sure I'm briefed on everything that happens in that meeting, she instructed. And prepare talking points about family unity and the importance of supporting His Majesty during challenging times. As Camilla ended the call, she felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with political combat. She had faced challenges before, from the press, from the public, from within the royal family itself, and she had always found ways to emerge stronger. This would be no different. But even as she began planning her response, Camilla couldn't shake the feeling that this challenge was different somehow. The involvement of the Archbishop added a moral dimension that made her usual tactics of bureaucratic maneuvering and access control less effective. For the first time since her marriage to Charles, she faced an opponent who couldn't be intimidated, marginalized, or controlled through normal palace mechanisms. At Kensington Palace, William was helping his children with their homework when Catherine approached him with a concerned expression. "I just had a call from Anne," she said quietly. "The Archbishop is meeting with your father tomorrow morning." William looked up from George's mathematics problems, hope and anxiety warring in his expression. How did she manage that? I thought Camilla controlled his schedule completely. Apparently, pastoral emergencies take precedence over normal scheduling, Catherine replied. The Archbishop can demand immediate access when he believes the spiritual welfare of the family is at stake. William felt a mixture of relief and nervous anticipation. This was the opportunity they had hoped for, a chance for someone with unquestionable moral authority to speak directly to his father about what was happening to their family. But he also knew that Camilla wouldn't simply accept this intervention passively. She would find ways to minimize its impact, to spin whatever the Archbishop said in terms that served her purposes. What happens next? Catherine asked. We wait, William said quietly. We wait, and we hope that enough of my father still exists underneath the king for him to hear what the Archbishop is really saying. As evenings settled over London, 3 separate households prepared for what they all understood would be a crucial confrontation. At Lambeth Palace, the Archbishop prepared his words carefully, knowing that he had perhaps one opportunity to break through the barriers that had been erected around the king. At Clarence House, Camilla marshaled her defenses, planning how to neutralize yet another challenge to her authority. And at Kensington Palace, William and Catherine tucked their children into bed, wondering what kind of family those children would inherit when the current crisis finally resolved itself. The next morning would bring the first direct challenge to Camilla's control, the first real test of whether the bonds of family and faith were stronger than the mechanisms of political manipulation. The future of the monarchy, and the happiness of 3 young children who deserved to know their grandfather's love, hung in the balance. The early morning fog clung to the grounds of Buckingham Palace as Archbishop Richardson's car passed through the gates, carrying him toward what he knew would be one of the most important conversations of his tenure as spiritual advisor to the royal family. He had spent the previous evening in prayer and contemplation, seeking guidance on how to broach the delicate subject of family unity with a monarch who seemed increasingly isolated from those who loved him most. King Charles was already waiting in his private study when the Archbishop was announced. The room was filled with the soft light of dawn filtering through tall windows, and Charles stood near his desk reviewing papers that the Archbishop suspected had little to do with state business. There was something diminished about the king's posture, a weariness that went beyond the normal fatigue of royal duties. Your Grace, Charles said warmly, moving to greet his visitor. Thank you for coming so early. I understand you have concerns about spiritual matters. Indeed, Your Majesty, the Archbishop replied, accepting the offered chair near the fireplace. I wanted to speak with you about something that weighs heavily on my heart, the spiritual health of your family. Charles settled into the chair opposite, his expression growing more attentive. Of course. Is there something specific that concerns you? Archbishop Richardson had rehearsed this conversation carefully, knowing that he needed to present his concerns in a way that would penetrate the defensive barriers that had been constructed around the king. Your Majesty, in my role as pastoral advisor, I've observed something troubling. The bonds between generations in your family seem to be weakening. Children are growing distant from their grandfather. Parents are struggling to maintain connections with their own father. This isn't just a family matter. It's a spiritual crisis that threatens the very foundation of what makes the monarchy strong. Charles frowned slightly, and the archbishop could see confusion in the king's eyes. I'm not sure I understand. My family relationships seem, well, they seem manageable. Perhaps not as frequent as in the past, but royal duties require certain sacrifices. Your Majesty, the archbishop said gently, when did you last have a spontaneous conversation with Prince George? When did you last read Charlotte a bedtime story? When did you last sit down with William not because it was scheduled, but simply because you wanted to spend time with your son? The questions hung in the air like a challenge. Charles sat back in his chair, and the archbishop could see him mentally reviewing recent months, searching for memories that seemed increasingly elusive. Well, there are protocols now, Charles said slowly. Security considerations, scheduling requirements. It's not as simple as it used to be. Your father managed to maintain close relationships with his children and grandchildren despite similar responsibilities, the archbishop observed quietly. Your grandmother certainly did. What's different now? Charles was quiet for a long moment, and the archbishop could see the wheels turning in the king's mind. Camilla helps me manage these things, he said finally. She handles the complexities so I can focus on state duties. It's very efficient. Efficiency, the archbishop repeated thoughtfully. Your Majesty, when did love become a matter of efficiency? When did family relationships become administrative tasks to be managed rather than treasures to be cherished? The words clearly struck something deep in Charles, and the archbishop saw a flicker of the man beneath the crown, a father and grandfather who was beginning to realize how much he had lost in pursuit of administrative simplicity. But, surely, Charles said, his voice carrying a note of defensiveness, there are considerations of protocol, of proper procedure. Camilla understands these things better than I do sometimes. She's very good at managing complex situations. She is indeed skilled at management, the archbishop agreed carefully. But, Your Majesty, I must ask, are your grandchildren a complex situation to be managed? Or are they children who need their grandfather's love? Is your son William a protocol challenge? Or is he a man who desperately wants to maintain a relationship with his father? Charles stood abruptly and moved to the window, staring out at the palace gardens where morning gardeners were beginning their work. The archbishop could see tension in the king's shoulders, the physical manifestation of internal conflict. You don't understand the pressures, Charles said quietly. The constant demands, the endless decisions. Camilla helps filter these things, helps me prioritize what's truly important. And who determines what's truly important? The archbishop asked gently. Your Majesty, yesterday I received information about proposed changes to the spiritual care protocols for your family. Changes that would require approval for any pastoral visits, any religious guidance, any spiritual ceremonies involving your children and grandchildren. Is limiting your family's access to spiritual care truly important? Charles turned from the window, his expression showing genuine surprise. What changes? I wasn't aware of any modifications to spiritual care protocols. The archbishop felt a moment of satisfaction. He had found a crack in the wall of administrative control that had been built around the king. The proposal came through official channels, bearing references to your Majesty's desire for greater coordination of family religious activities. But you're saying you weren't consulted about this? No, I wasn't specifically consulted, Charles admitted, his confusion growing. But Camilla often handles these administrative details. She briefs me on the important points. Your Majesty, the archbishop said, leaning forward with gentle intensity. In your opinion, would controlling your family's access to spiritual guidance be an important point? Would limiting your children's ability to seek pastoral care be something you would want to approve personally? Charles sank back into his chair, and the archbishop could see the weight of realization beginning to settle on the king's shoulders. Of course I would want to know about that. Spiritual guidance for my family that's not administrative detail, that's fundamental. Indeed it is, the archbishop agreed. And yet decisions are being made in your name about fundamental aspects of your family's spiritual life. Decisions that create barriers between people who should love each other freely. The study door opened quietly, and Camilla entered without being announced. She wore a perfectly composed smile, but the Archbishop could see tension around her eyes as she took in the scene before her. "Darling," she said to Charles, "I'm sorry to interrupt, but we need to review the morning briefings before your 10 o'clock appointment." "Actually," Charles said, not moving from his chair, "I'd like to continue this conversation with the Archbishop. Could we postpone the briefings for a few minutes?" The Archbishop saw something flicker across Camilla's face. Surprise, perhaps, or concern. "Of course," she said smoothly. "But perhaps I could provide some context if there are family matters being discussed. I've been handling many of the coordination details." "That's exactly what we were discussing," the Archbishop said, his voice carrying quiet authority. "The extent of coordination and management being applied to family relationships." Camilla moved to stand behind Charles's chair, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder in a gesture that appeared supportive but struck the Archbishop as possessive. "Family coordination is complex in our situation," she said. "There are security considerations, protocol requirements, scheduling challenges. Someone needs to manage these details so His Majesty can focus on his primary duties." "But at what cost?" the Archbishop asked directly. "When management becomes separation, when coordination becomes control, when efficiency becomes isolation, are we still serving the family, or are we serving some other purpose?" Charles looked up at Camilla with an expression the Archbishop couldn't quite read. "Darling," the Archbishop was asking about spiritual care protocols, changes that apparently require approval for pastoral visits to family members. "I wasn't aware we had made such changes." Camilla's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on Charles's shoulder. "Those are simply administrative streamlining measures," she said smoothly, "to ensure consistency and proper coordination. Nothing that would actually limit spiritual care, just better organization." "But who would provide the approval for such visits?" the Archbishop asked pointedly. "Who would determine what spiritual care is appropriate for family members?" "Well, naturally, that would be coordinated through the appropriate offices," Camilla replied, her tone suggesting the question was somehow inappropriate. "Which offices?" Charles asked, and the Archbishop heard a new note in the king's voice, a sharpness that suggested he was beginning to ask questions he hadn't asked before. Camilla's smile faltered slightly. "The office of the Queen Consort handles family coordination matters, darling. You know that. We've discussed this." "Have we?" Charles asked quietly. "I remember discussions about efficiency and better organization, but I don't remember discussing giving approval authority over spiritual care for my children and grandchildren." The Archbishop watched the exchange with growing interest. Something was shifting in the dynamics of the room, some crack appearing in the wall of control that had been so carefully constructed. "Charles," Camilla said, her tone taking on a slightly sharper edge, "you're obviously tired. Perhaps we should continue these discussions after you've had time to review the relevant documents and understand the full context." "I'm not tired," Charles said, standing up from his chair. "I'm confused. I'm confused about how decisions are being made in my name that I don't remember making. I'm confused about why my son was apparently escorted from Clarence House yesterday. I'm confused about why my grandchildren need appointments to see me." The Archbishop felt a surge of hope. The fog of administrative manipulation was beginning to clear, and the king was starting to see the reality of what had been happening around him. Camilla's composure was beginning to crack. "Charles, you're being influenced by people who don't understand the complexities of your position. The Archbishop means well, but he doesn't have to make the difficult decisions you face every day." "The decision to love my family shouldn't be difficult," Charles said quietly, but with growing conviction. "The decision to see my grandchildren shouldn't require bureaucratic approval. The decision to have honest conversations with my son shouldn't be a matter of protocol management." The Archbishop rose from his chair, sensing that his role in this conversation was largely complete. He had planted the seeds of doubt and reflection that needed to grow, and further intervention might actually be counterproductive. "Your Majesty," he said formally, "I believe you have much to consider, but I would ask you to remember that family love, like divine love, cannot be efficiently managed or bureaucratically controlled. It must flow freely, or it ceases to be love at all." Charles nodded slowly, his eyes meeting the Archbishop's with what appeared to be genuine gratitude. "Thank you, Your Grace. You've given me much to think about." As the Archbishop prepared to leave, Camilla stepped forward. "Your Grace, I hope you understand that any changes in family protocols have been made with the best intentions, with the goal of protecting His Majesty from unnecessary stress complications." The Archbishop looked directly at Camilla, and when he spoke, His voice carried the full moral authority of his office. "Ma'am, the road to spiritual destruction is often paved with good intentions. When we separate people from love in the name of protection, when we build walls between family members in the name of efficiency, we risk destroying the very things we claim to be protecting." The words hung in the air as the Archbishop took his leave, but their impact was evident in the changed atmosphere of the room. Charles stood looking out the window again, but his posture was different now, more upright, more thoughtful. Camilla remained behind his chair, but her position no longer looked protective, it looked defensive. As the Archbishop's car pulled away from Buckingham Palace, he offered a quiet prayer for wisdom and healing within the royal family. He had done what he could to open the king's eyes to what was happening around him. What happened next would depend on whether Charles had the courage to act on what he was beginning to understand. At Kensington Palace, William's phone buzzed with a text message from Princess and seeds planted. Now we wait to see what grows. The battle for the soul of the royal family had entered a new phase, and, for the first time in months, those fighting for family unity had reason for cautious optimism. The confrontation that would define the future of the monarchy began with something as simple as a child's birthday party. Prince George's 11th birthday was approaching, and Catherine had called Clarence House to discuss arrangements, expecting the usual complicated negotiations about schedules and protocols. Instead, she was told that His Majesty would unfortunately be unable to attend due to a conflicting state engagement that could not be moved. Catherine knew this was a lie. She had access to the court's circular and could see that no state engagements were scheduled for that weekend. When she mentioned this discrepancy to the private secretary, she was told that the king's schedule was subject to last-minute changes and that family events, while important, had to be balanced against royal duties. It was this final insult, the casual dismissal of a grandfather's presence at his grandson's birthday as less important than non-existent state duties, that finally pushed William past his breaking point. He didn't call ahead, didn't make an appointment, didn't follow any of the protocols that had been established to limit access to his father. Instead, he drove directly to Clarence House and walked through the front door with the confidence of someone who belonged there. The staff recognized him, of course, and no one dared to stop the heir to the throne as he made his way through corridors that had once been as familiar as his own home. But William could see the nervous glances, the whispered conversations, the sense of panic that his unexpected arrival was creating among Camilla's carefully placed personnel. He found Camilla in the same study where their previous confrontation had taken place, seated behind her desk reviewing what appeared to be guest lists for upcoming events. She looked up as he entered, and William was struck by how quickly her expression shifted from surprise to calculation to carefully controlled anger. "William," she said, not rising from her chair. "This is unexpected. I don't believe you have an appointment." "I don't need an appointment to see my father," William replied, his voice calm, but carrying an undertone of steel. "Where is he?" "His Majesty is in his private apartments, preparing for an important meeting," Camilla said smoothly. "Perhaps if you called ahead next time, we could arrange something more suitable." "The only thing that needs arranging is for you to stop lying to my family," William said, taking a step closer to her desk. "There is no state engagement this weekend. There is no important meeting. There is only a little boy who wants his grandfather at his birthday party, and a grandmother-in-law who seems determined to prevent that from happening." Camilla's mask of composure slipped slightly. "I don't know what you're implying, but His Majesty's schedule is complex and demanding. If there are conflicts with family events, that's simply the reality of royal duty." "Stop," William said quietly, but with such intensity that Camilla actually flinched. "Just stop. I'm not a child anymore, and I'm not going to stand here and listen to you gaslight me about my own father's schedule. I know what you're doing, and more importantly, I think he's finally beginning to understand it too." The reference to Charles's growing awareness clearly struck home. Camilla's eyes flashed with something that looked like fear, quickly masked by renewed anger. "You have no idea what you're talking about," she said, standing up from her desk. "Your father is king now, with responsibilities that extend far beyond your personal family grievances. If you can't accept that, perhaps the problem isn't with his schedule, but with your expectations." "My expectations?" William's voice rose slightly, the careful control beginning to crack. "My expectations that a grandfather should be able to attend his grandson's birthday party? My expectations that a father should be accessible to his children? My expectations that family relationships shouldn't require bureaucratic approval." The door to the study opened, and two security guards entered, clearly alerted by the raised voices. William recognized them from his previous visit, the same men who had been present when Camilla had ordered him escorted from the building. "Ma'am," one of them said carefully, "is everything all right?" William looked at the guards, then back at Camilla, understanding flooding through him. "You're actually considering having me removed again, aren't you? The heir to the throne, ejected from a royal building because I want to see my father. I'm considering maintaining order and respect in this household," Camilla replied, her voice taking on the imperious tone that William remembered from their previous confrontation. "If you can't conduct yourself appropriately, then, yes, you'll be asked to leave." It was at that moment that King Charles appeared in the doorway, having apparently heard the commotion from his apartments. He took in the scene before him, his wife behind her desk flanked by security guards, his son standing in the middle of the room, with fury radiating from every line of his body, the tension so thick it was almost visible. "What's going on here?" Charles asked quietly. William turned to face his father, and, for a moment, neither spoke. Charles looked older than William remembered, more tired, but there was something different in his eyes, a clarity that hadn't been there in recent months. "I came to ask if you wanted to attend your grandson's birthday party," William said simply. "I was told you have a conflicting state engagement." Charles frowned, looking confused. "What state engagement? This weekend? I don't recall any official commitments." Camilla stepped forward quickly. "Darling, we discussed the possibility of scheduling conflicts. There are always last-minute obligations that might arise." "Did we discuss that?" Charles asked, and William could hear genuine uncertainty in his father's voice. "I don't remember discussing anything specific about George's birthday." "Charles, you've been under enormous pressure lately," Camilla said, her tone becoming softer, more concerned. "Sometimes the details blur together. But we always have to be prepared for official duties to take precedence." William watched his father's face as Camilla spoke, and he could see the internal struggle playing out. Part of Charles wanted to accept this explanation to avoid the uncomfortable realization that he was being manipulated. But part of him, the part that was still a father and grandfather, was beginning to rebel against the constraints that had been placed around him. "I don't want official duties to take precedence over George's birthday," Charles said slowly, as if testing the words as he spoke them. "I want to be there." "Of course you do, darling," Camilla said quickly. "And we'll certainly try to arrange that if the schedule permits." "No," Charles said more firmly, and William felt a surge of hope. "I don't need the schedule to permit it. I'm making time for it. George's birthday is important to me." Camilla's composure finally cracked completely. "Charles, you can't just ignore protocol and scheduling requirements because of sentimental attachment. You're the king now. Your personal desires can't always come first." "Sentimental attachment?" Charles repeated, his voice rising. "To my grandson? To my family?" William saw his opportunity and stepped forward. "Father, there's something you need to understand. This isn't just about George's birthday. This is about a pattern that's been developing for months. Access to you has become increasingly controlled. Decisions are being made in your name without your direct involvement. Your family is being systematically separated from you in the name of efficiency and protocol." Charles looked between William and Camilla, and William could see the pieces beginning to fit together in his father's mind. "The spiritual care protocols," Charles said suddenly. "The Archbishop mentioned changes that I hadn't personally approved. Those were administrative streamlining measures," Camilla said quickly, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. "And the security changes for the children?" William pressed. "Did you personally approve dismissing their protection detail without consultation with Catherine and me?" Charles turned to look at Camilla with growing alarm. "What security changes? What dismissals?" Camilla realized she was cornered, that the careful web of half-truths and administrative justifications was finally collapsing. Her response was swift and desperate. "Guards," she said sharply, her voice cutting across the room. "His Royal Highness is becoming agitated and disruptive. Please escort him from the premises immediately." The two security guards moved toward William, but their steps were hesitant, uncertain. They could see King Charles standing right there, could see his obvious confusion and growing distress at what was unfolding before him. "Ma'am," one of the guards said carefully, "perhaps His Majesty should—" "I gave you an order," Camilla snapped, her mask of controlled authority completely abandoned now. "Remove him from this building immediately." It was the moment of truth that William had been anticipating for months. The naked assertion of power, the attempt to have him physically removed from his own father's presence, the demonstration of exactly how far Camilla's control had extended. But it was also the moment when that control finally overreached itself. Charles stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice carried the full authority of the crown. "Stand down," he said to the guards. "No one is being removed from anywhere." The guards immediately stepped back, their relief at receiving clear orders from the actual king evident on their faces. Charles turned to face Camilla, and William saw something in his father's expression that he hadn't seen in years: true kingly authority, unmarred by uncertainty or the need for approval. "Camilla," Charles said quietly, "did you just order my son to be physically removed from my presence?" "Charles, you don't understand the complexities," Camilla began. "Answer the question," Charles said, his voice cutting through her attempted explanation like a blade. "Did you order my heir, my son, to be removed from this building?" Camilla's face went through a series of expressions: defiance, calculation, desperation, and, finally, something approaching defeat. "I was trying to maintain order and respect," she said weakly. "By having my son forcibly removed?" Charles pressed. "By making that decision without consulting me. By treating the future King of England like an unwelcome intruder in a royal residence." William stepped forward, his eyes burning with the fury that had been building for months, but now carried with it the satisfaction of vindication. "Father, this is what I've been trying to tell you. This is how she sees your family, as problems to be managed, obstacles to be removed, threats to her control over your life." Charles looked at his son, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in months. He saw the pain there, the frustration, the love that had been rebuffed and bureaucratized until it had nearly turned to despair. He saw his own failures reflected in William's eyes, the gradual abdication of paternal responsibility, the willingness to let others manage the relationships that should have been sacred to him. "William," Charles said quietly, "I think I owe you an enormous apology." Camilla made one final attempt to regain control of the situation. "Charles, you're both being overly emotional about this. If we could just sit down and discuss this rationally." "No," Charles said, turning to face his wife with an expression of profound disappointment. "There will be no more discussion, no more rationalization, no more management of my family relationships. This ends now." William felt something shift in the room's atmosphere, the sense of long-held tensions finally being released, of truth finally being acknowledged, of power dynamics that had been distorted for months finally snapping back into their proper alignment. Charles walked to where William stood and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Will you forgive a foolish old man who nearly lost sight of what was truly important?" William felt tears prick at his eyes, tears of relief, of gratitude, of love that had been constrained for too long. "Of course, Father. I just want my children to know their grandfather." "They will," Charles said firmly, "starting with George's birthday party this weekend, and continuing with regular, unscheduled, bureaucracy-free visits whenever they want to see me." Camilla stood behind her desk, her carefully constructed empire of control crumbling around her. But, even in defeat, William could see her mind working, calculating new approaches, new strategies for regaining influence. Charles seemed to sense this as well. He turned to face Camilla one final time, and, when he spoke, his words carried the weight of irrevocable decision. "Camilla, your involvement in family scheduling and protocol is finished. From now on, my relationships with my children and grandchildren will be managed by me and me alone. Is that understood?" The queen consort nodded stiffly, her face a mask of barely controlled rage and humiliation. As William and his father left the study together, walking side by side through the corridors of Clarence House, William felt a profound sense of relief and hope. The battle for his father's soul had been won, the walls of manipulation and control had been torn down, and the bonds of family love had proven stronger than the mechanisms of bureaucratic power. But, even as they walked, William knew that this victory, complete as it felt in the moment, was likely just the beginning of a longer struggle. Camilla would not simply accept her diminished role passively. She would adapt, evolve her tactics, look for new ways to exert influence and control. The war for the future of the monarchy was far from over. But, for the first time in months, William felt confident about which side would ultimately prevail. Love, it turned out, was indeed stronger than management. Family bonds, when finally, freed from administrative interference, proved more durable than political manipulation. And Prince George would have his grandfather at his birthday party after all.